watching Money Talk Viewpoint, and I'm Chantel Leeson. Welcome to our show today. Let's have a special guest for today. This is Judith Pearson. I got it right. Once a person gets into the right entity that can help them work through these issues, I'm going to be reaching out to you. You know that.
I hope so.
those are important factors. Let me ask you, what are the trends you're seeing in families implementing the wealth transfer vehicles?
So I am seeing a huge uptick in the private trust companies. Some of the things that I think are more interesting is looking at some of the families who have created significant equity with businesses. Let's take Patagonia, for example. I see a lot of trends in, really wanting to have control over more than what I would call the ESG, but truly the mission of the family and the founder, and creating 50C4 entities. So they're nonprofit entities that own the stock that can continue the mission of the founder, which I find fascinating. I think it's a really interesting structure. I think that over time, we're going to see what's going to play out in terms of the risk characteristics, because as we all know, everything changes. We can just look at, the Paul Newman litigation that we saw, where Paul Newman set up a certain structure that really isn't so dissimilar from what we're talking about, but then the taxes changed. And so they had to change the structure, which changed some of the risk characteristics. So all I'm saying is I love the structure. I think it's fascinating, but we have to keep close eye on what are the risk characteristics. So that's one. Another one is, I don't know if you've heard of B corporations, which are essentially certified that they're really a benefit corporation benefiting the ESG type things. I've heard a couple of trusts wanting to look at being a B trust. So again, it's the family members creating a legacy of what they really want to see, of what they want to do in the world. So there's a ton of trends. It just depends on where you are in scale, what you want to do with your family, what is the legacy, and what do the family dynamics look like? Are there people in the family that have been trained and engaged to carry on the legacy? That's a whole nother issue.
Yeah. You know what? As you were talking, I was thinking, because there's a new burgeoning society within our society that's growing in wealth that did not exist in the past. And they're not necessarily, sometimes they're 22-year-olds who are in IT, but sometimes they're 65-year-olds who have had a wealth of knowledge and are able to put that to work after they've left their corporate life, because they want to transfer wealth to their families. And I think this is where this comes into play, because it's not just a matter of just building wealth, it's how you maintain it and then how you transfer that wealth. It's a very important factor. You're having a lot of material here. How have trust and other wealth vehicles evolved over the past 20 years?
So if you go back, call it 25, 30 years ago, the statistics were something like 25% of all trusts were being handled by large institutions, the Bessemers, the U.S. Trust, the whatever. And 75% were really family member and maybe friends of the family. And that was the traditional trust structure. And then what started happening was families wanted more control. Families' wealth was not so much marketable securities anymore, but, real estate and farms and equity and startups and cryptocurrencies and what have you. And a lot of the institutions were getting uncomfortable with handling these assets, number one. And number two, the fee structure was one lump fee. And they wanted transparency on what the fee looked like. And some really smart people started looking at it, and they created what we now call the directed trust environment. And that created a whole new business. You can go to South Dakota 25 years ago and see how many trust companies there were. I think it was 0. And now there's well over 100 serving that administrative role. And other states followed suit. So you've got Nevada, Alaska. I mean, we can go through, and that's changing. And it was with the adoption of the Uniform Trust Act that different states started looking at what are we doing, and that's still evolving. And once that started evolving, it gave people more flexibility to create some of the structures that I'm talking about today. So I think this collision of extraordinary wealth in many different forms with the changing laws have created this entirely new industry.
And you're right. I was thinking, to talk about extraordinary wealth, I think about the very obvious, and that's the entertainment and athletes.
Mm-hmm.
This would have never existed 20 years ago. We're seeing in the wealth that they're creating, not just in their sports, but even after their profession. But aside from that, they're building businesses and buying into corporations and franchises and real estate and becoming, I look at Shaquille O'Neal. Isn't he a billionaire now?
Yeah, and it's so interesting that you mentioned that. I've just come back from 2 conferences over the last, I guess, since May. So a conference in May and a conference in July, where they had panels of athletes that were extraordinarily entrepreneurs. I mean, it was so fascinating to see what they're trying to do with their wealth, and really exciting, actually, because up until recently, it felt like, I don't have the facts or the statistics, but whether it was entertainment or athletes, I guess they're kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
They're being managed and they weren't being educated. And now they've got people really sitting them down and helping them educate, and they're giving back to the communities in extraordinary ways. I love it.
In fact, my next speaker, I'm going to get probably next week, that's what she works with, is entertainers and athletes. And that's what they do. They educate these people on what to do with their money while they're still in their profession, so that while they move along, they're prepared for growing their wealth. And that's where my family office is. We're looking at that entity of it, not just, I've moved away from product sales. I no longer sell securities or insurance. I stopped doing it. I can educate on it, but I want to do more than just look for a commission. I want to be able to offer high quality service. So I look for people like you to bring on, or that we'll be reaching out to. So I'm glad you're here. What should families be thinking?
I want to stay there though for a second, because I've only seen 2 panels and talked with the folks after the panels twice, right? So you've got way more insight. But I kind of got the following questions. I've been told I need a family office. Should I have a family office? I'm like, well, what are you trying to solve? And then they're off to the next thing. So while I think that we're in the early stages of having these people do great things with their wealth and build, entrepreneurship, there's a next step. And I hope that people start talking about, what do you really want to do now that you're building the wealth with your legacy, and set it up today? And what are you doing to talk to your children about it? Because maybe those children aren't going to be entertainment or athletes, but they're going to be entrepreneurs. They're going to be founding businesses. But it's that whole financial education to those entertainment professionals and their family members, which is what gets into what I do.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's exactly what it is. All their kids are not going to make it to play sports. And they're not all going to be on stage. And some of these kids, isn't Bill Gates' daughter a doctor? Yeah. So all the kids don't necessarily want to follow into the family footsteps, but they do need to have the education on how to manage that wealth going forward.
And what it means. Like I know a lot of families, people are getting much better at talking to the next generation about their wealth and the structure, but it's not there yet. And what I see on these dynamics is that people can't find their voice because they don't know what the structures mean. There are a lot of organizations out there who do beneficiary education and trustee education, because that's how we're going to keep these families together and in the same direction. So you can be a doctor, but you can also be participating on the councils on what do you want to see from a legacy perspective and a philanthropic perspective. But if you don't know what these vehicles do, if you don't know what your rights are, and if you don't know what the goals and objectives and what you're not supposed to do with it, you're not going to have that family great, continuing legacy.